In January of 1914, I did something that every economist in America said would bankrupt my company within 1 year. Every newspaper that covered the story used the word reckless. Several of the wealthiest men in the country wrote to me privately to say I had lost my mind. The men who ran competing factories were publicly furious. And the men who worked for me, the ones who would directly benefit from what I had just announced, did not believe it was real until the first paycheck arrived. What I announced that morning was a minimum wage of $5 a day for every worker in my factory. The standard at the time was $2.34. I was doubling it and then some. But here is the thing that nobody tells you about that decision. It was not an act of charity. It was not a moral gesture. It was the most calculated and deliberate business decision I ever made. And the reasoning behind it, the specific chain of thinking that produced it, is the same reasoning that built the American middle class, and that is available to anyone who understands it clearly enough to apply it to their own situation. Stay with me. Because what I am going to tell you about why I did it, and what happened after, will change how you think about money, markets, and what it means to build something that lasts. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from a workshop behind my house. I built the Model T, which put more working people behind a wheel than anyone had imagined possible. I built the moving assembly line, and in January of 1914, I did something that no major manufacturer had ever done before in the history of American industry. I paid my workers enough money to actually buy the thing they were making. That sentence sounds obvious when I say it now. It should have been obvious in 1913. It was not. The prevailing logic of every factory in the country was that workers were a cost to be minimized. The lower the wage, the lower the cost, the higher the profit. This logic was applied with complete consistency across the entire manufacturing industry. And it produced, with equal consistency, a specific result: workers who could not afford to buy the goods they made, a market that was limited to the wealthy, an economy that could only grow as fast as the purchasing power of people who were already wealthy allowed it to grow, which was not very fast at all. I did not set out to create the American middle class. I set out to solve a specific problem in my factory. What I accidentally discovered in the process of solving that problem was the mechanism by which ordinary working people can participate in the prosperity they create. And that mechanism, once understood, is one of the most practically useful things I know about how wealth works in the real world. By the end of this message, you will understand exactly what the problem was that the $5 day was designed to solve, why doubling wages made the company more profitable rather than less, and what the specific principle behind that outcome means for how you think about the relationship between what you pay people and what you receive in return. Listen to this every day. The man who hears this once understands a piece of history. The man who hears it 30 times understands something about economics that most educated people in positions of power still get wrong. Most people who know American history in a general way have a sense that life was harder before the 20th century. Fewer conveniences, longer working hours, less comfort. But the specific texture of that hardness, what it actually looked like day to day in the life of an ordinary working man, is something that has been softened in the telling over time. Let me be precise about it. In the years before 1914, the industrial working man in America had one realistic financial option: survival. Not comfort, not saving, not planning for anything beyond the current season. Survival. He worked long hours, typically 10 to 12 per day, 6 days a week, for wages that covered basic food, basic shelter, and almost nothing beyond that. His children worked as soon as they were physically capable of contributing to the household income. His wife worked. Every productive member of the family contributed to a household budget that, despite the full effort of everyone in it, produced very little margin. The concept of discretionary income, money beyond what was needed for immediate survival, did not apply to the lives of most American workers in that period. The automobile was a luxury item available only to the wealthy. Most working men would never own one. It was as remote from their daily lives as a private yacht. The men who built automobiles for a living could not afford to own one. This was not considered a problem that required solving. It was considered the natural order of things. The wealthy owned things. Workers worked. The wage was what the market would bear, and the market bore just enough to keep workers fed and housed and available for work the following morning. I grew up watching this system operate at close range. My father's farm was not a wealthy farm. The men I worked alongside at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit were not wealthy men. They worked hard, they earned their wages honestly, and they lived in a state of financial constraint that allowed for very little beyond what was necessary. I was not unique in understanding that the working man's life was hard. Everyone understood that. What was not understood was that the hardness of the working man's life was a structural problem with a structural solution, not a moral problem, not a problem of individual effort or virtue. A structural problem in how wages were set in relation to the goods those wages were supposed to produce a market for. Here is what was happening in my factory in 1913 that drove the $5 day decision. I want to be precise about the actual problem because the popular version of the story makes it sound like a spontaneous act of generosity. It was not. It was a response to a specific and serious operational problem. The turnover rate at the Highland Park plant in 1913 was extraordinary. To keep a workforce of around 14,000 men employed and trained, we hired approximately 53,000 men in the course of that year. The workers were leaving and being replaced at a rate that was genuinely costly in both financial and operational terms. Every new worker required training time before he was productive. Every departing worker carried with him a level of skill and experience that had cost real money to develop. The constant churning of the workforce was a significant drag on the efficiency and the quality of the production. Why were the workers leaving at such a rate? The wage was $2.34 per day. The work was hard and repetitive. The assembly line process, which I had implemented to increase production efficiency, had made the work more demanding in a specific way. The pace of the line was set, and the worker had to match it consistently across his entire shift. This was more taxing than work at a self-determined pace. The men who found comparable wages available elsewhere with less demanding conditions took them. There was nothing preventing them from leaving because $2.34 per day gave them no financial reason to stay that could not be matched by another employer. This was the specific problem, not a moral outrage about low wages. A specific, measurable, operationally damaging problem of workforce instability that was costing money in training costs, inefficiency costs, and quality costs that could be precisely calculated. The solution to the problem was straightforward once I was willing to think about it, without the constraint of conventional thinking about wages. If I raised the wage high enough that it was significantly better than anything available elsewhere, men would have a specific financial reason to stay. The turnover would drop, the training costs would drop. The efficiency losses from constantly introducing new workers would drop. The quality of the work would improve because experienced workers produce better work than inexperienced ones. And the net cost of the higher wage, offset against all of these savings, might be lower than the net cost of the lower wage, plus the turnover-related losses. When I ran the numbers with this framework, the math supported the case for a significant wage increase. The question was, how large, not how small. The number I arrived at was $5 per day, more than double the prevailing wage. Not a 10% increase, not a 20% increase, more than double. I want to explain why the number was that large, because this is the part of the decision that contained something larger than just the solution to my specific turnover problem. It contained the discovery that would eventually build the middle class. When I was thinking about what wage would be large enough to genuinely change the financial situation of the workers who received it, I thought about a specific thing. I thought about what it would take for a man who worked in my factory to be able to buy the product he was making. A Model T in 1914 cost around $825. At $2.34 per day, a worker earning that wage would need to work for nearly a year and a half at full wages, spending nothing on food, rent, clothing, or anything else, to save enough to buy the car. Under real-life conditions, with actual household expenses, it would take several years of careful saving, and most workers were not in a financial position to save at all. At $5 per day, the calculation changed completely. A worker earning $5 a day could, with genuine discipline over a shorter period, actually save enough to buy the car he was building. Not easily, not instantly, but within a range that was actually achievable rather than theoretically possible, but practically inaccessible. When I sat with that realization, I understood something that I do not think I had understood clearly before. The product I was making was never going to reach its full market potential as long as the men who made it could not afford to buy it. The wealthy would buy automobiles regardless of price. But the wealthy were a small market. The large market, the market that would eventually put every working family in the country on wheels, was the market of working people. And working people could not participate in that market until their wages gave them enough purchasing power to actually buy things beyond survival necessities. This is the mechanism that built the middle class. Not charity, not politics. The specific economic logic that connects wages to purchasing power, to market size, to production volume, to profitability. The more workers earn, the more they can buy. The more they buy, the larger the market. The larger the market, the more production is needed. The more production is needed, the more workers are employed. The more workers are employed at decent wages, the more buying happens. The cycle feeds itself. Every other factory owner in America in 1913 was trying to extract maximum profit from the narrow market of the wealthy by paying workers as little as possible. I was trying to create a wider market by paying workers enough to participate in it. The approach was different. The profitability that resulted was also significantly different. The morning of January 5th, 1914, we issued the announcement. $5 per day for every worker who met the qualification standards. The announcement also included a reduction in the working day from 9 hours to 8. The reaction was immediate, and it was not what I had anticipated in its specific form. I expected opposition from competing manufacturers. I expected skeptical commentary from financial observers. I expected questions about whether the numbers were actually workable. What I did not fully anticipate was the physical scale of the response from men looking for work at the new wage. Within days, thousands of men had arrived in Detroit looking for jobs at the Ford plant. They came from across the country. They came from factories in other cities, from farms, from situations of genuine hardship. They had heard that there was a factory paying $5 a day, and they came, in numbers that were not manageable at the gates of the plant, to get a chance at those wages. It became dangerous. The crowds were too large. There were cold days in those first weeks when men had been waiting for hours outside the plant with no guarantee of work. We had to manage the situation with some urgency because the response had exceeded anything we had prepared for. I will be honest that the scale of the response shook me in a specific way that I had not expected. I had calculated the economics of the wage increase carefully. I had not fully reckoned with what those economics would mean to the men who heard about it. The size of the crowd that arrived at those gates in January of 1914 was a physical representation of how far below what was needed the prevailing wage had been. Those were not men looking for a windfall. They were men trying to reach a position where they could save something, plan something, build something beyond survival. And the $5 day, which to financial commentators looked like recklessness, looked to those men like the first real opening they had ever been given. The newspapers had predicted catastrophe. 1 year later, the numbers told a different story. Turnover had dropped dramatically. The workforce that had churned through 53,000 hires in 1913 was now stable. The training costs associated with that turnover had dropped to a fraction of what they had been. The efficiency of experienced workers compared to newly trained ones showed in the production numbers. Output per worker had increased. Quality had improved. The cost per unit of production had fallen even as the wage had more than doubled. The wage increase that was supposed to destroy the company's profitability had increased it, not because of any magic. Because of the specific mathematics of workforce stability and efficiency that I had calculated before the announcement, and that the announcement had confirmed. But something else had happened that was larger than the workforce mathematics. Workers at the Ford plant were buying Ford cars. Not all of them, not immediately. But within the period of a few years following the wage increase, the number of Ford workers who owned Ford cars was measurable and growing. Men who had previously been outside the automobile market entirely were inside it. They were customers, and they were telling their neighbors and their relatives and everyone they knew about the car they had saved to buy, producing the most effective form of promotion that has ever existed. A genuine user speaking with genuine enthusiasm to people who trusted them. The market expanded, not just from Ford workers. The $5 day widely publicized changed the conversation about wages across the industry. Other manufacturers, some grudgingly and slowly, raised their wages in response to competitive pressure for workers. As wages rose across the industry, the purchasing power of working people across the country increased. And as purchasing power increased, the market for goods expanded. This is the mechanism I mean when I say the middle class was created rather than simply appearing. It was not the natural result of economic growth. It was the specific result of wages being set high enough that working people could participate in markets beyond subsistence. That decision, made first by me in 1914 and slowly adopted across industry over the following decades, is what produced the broad consumer economy that America eventually became. There is a part of the $5 day story that is almost never included in the telling of it, and I want to include it here because it is practically relevant and because omitting it creates a misleading picture of what the decision actually was. The $5 wage was not automatic for every worker. There were specific requirements attached to it, administered through what we called the sociological department. Workers who wanted to qualify for the full $5 had to meet certain standards of conduct in their personal lives. The company sent investigators to visit workers' homes. Workers were expected to maintain reasonably clean living conditions. They were expected to avoid excessive use of alcohol. They were expected to demonstrate financial responsibility, not spending their wages in ways that would leave their families in hardship. I am not going to pretend this was without controversy or that every element of it was designed in the best possible way. The oversight was paternalistic by any honest assessment, and I have had mixed feelings about aspects of it in the years since. But the principle behind it was not wrong, even if the implementation had real problems. The principle was this: a wage increase that does not produce a genuine improvement in the financial stability and living conditions of the workers who receive it serves no one well. If $5 per day was spent in ways that kept workers in the same instability they had been in at $2.34, the money had produced no lasting change in their position. The qualification standards were an attempt to ensure that the wage increase actually changed the trajectory of workers' lives rather than simply passing through them without lasting effect. The specific lesson that the qualification element contains, for anyone who is thinking about how to use income to build wealth rather than simply to sustain consumption, is this: a larger income changes your situation only if you direct a portion of it toward building something that persists. A raise that is entirely consumed by expanded consumption produces a more comfortable version of the same financial position rather than a fundamentally different one. The worker who received $5 per day and used the increase to improve his housing, to begin saving, to reduce debt, was building something. The worker who received $5 per day and simply spent it at the same rate of living in proportion to income had more of the same thing rather than a different thing. This is one of the most important and least discussed lessons of the $5 day. More income is necessary but not sufficient for a different financial position. What you do with the difference between your previous income and your new income is what determines whether the increase produces a different life or simply a more expensive version of the same one. There was a worker in the plant in those years, a man named Arthur, who came to my attention in a way that is worth describing because it captures something about the $5 day that the statistics alone do not. Arthur had come to Detroit from somewhere in the South, one of the many thousands who arrived after the announcement. He had worked in the plant for about 18 months when someone in management brought a situation to my attention. Arthur had qualified for the full $5 wage without difficulty. He had met the standards, maintained his household well, and was regarded as a reliable and capable worker on the line. But there was something else going on. In his own time, outside the plant, Arthur had been running a small side operation. He was repairing watches and small mechanical items for people in his neighborhood, charging modest fees that were adding meaningfully to his household income. The operation was small, but it was real. It was producing something. And Arthur was reinvesting a portion of the combined income from the plant and the side work into tools and materials that were slowly expanding what he could offer. The situation brought to me was about whether the side operation was acceptable under our guidelines or whether it represented some conflict with his employment. My answer was immediate. Not only was it acceptable, it was the best possible use of the financial position the $5 day had given him. He had taken the increased income and used it as a foundation to build something additional. He had not simply consumed the raise. He had used it as capital. Arthur left the plant eventually, as I understood it, to run his repair business full-time. I do not know how large it became, but his story is the specific mechanism I was hoping the $5 day would produce, writ small and personal. A man given enough financial stability to see beyond immediate survival, using that stability as a foundation to build something of his own. Not everyone did this. Arthur did. And the ones who did were the ones who understood, intuitively if not intellectually, that the raise was a starting position, not a destination. This is the practical application of the $5 day lesson for anyone listening to this message. Whatever your current income is, the first question to ask is not how to spend the next dollar that arrives. The question is what portion of the current income is building something that will persist beyond your direct continued effort. If the answer is none, then the income level is not the primary problem. The direction of the income is. Here is the first exercise. It is simple, and most people find it uncomfortable when they actually do it. Take the last 30 days of your spending. Every category. Write down, honestly, what percentage of what came in went to each of the following 4 destinations. The first destination is pure consumption, things that are gone when you have used them. Food, rent, utilities, entertainment, clothing, everything that is consumed and leaves nothing behind except the experience of having consumed it. The second destination is tools, things that expand your capability, books, equipment, materials, anything that increases what you can do or produce in the future. These are expenditures that have a return beyond the immediate use. The third destination is building, direct investment in something that will produce income without requiring your continued direct effort, savings that are aimed at a specific productive use, capital directed towards something that will work when you are not working. The fourth destination is waste, spending that serves neither comfort, nor capability, nor building, spending that happens automatically, without deliberate choice, and that you would not choose if you were deciding consciously. Write the percentages honestly. Then, ask one question. If this ratio stays the same for the next 3 years, what position will I be in? Most people discover, when they do this exercise, that the ratio is heavily weighted toward consumption and waste, with very little in tools and almost nothing in building. This is not a judgment of character. It is a reflection of how money behaves when it is not deliberately directed. It flows to the loudest demands, which are almost always the immediate consumption demands, and the quiet demands of building receive almost nothing unless they are protected deliberately. The $5 day created the middle class only for the workers who received it and directed some portion of the increase toward building rather than toward expanded consumption alone. The income increase is the necessary first step. The direction of the increase is what determines whether the first step produces a different destination or simply a more comfortable version of the same one. Here is the part of the story that I find most interesting from a purely economic standpoint, and that I have never quite understood how people at the time missed it. The manufacturers who were most publicly opposed to the $5 day were, in almost every case, manufacturers of goods that working people might buy. They made furniture, clothing, tools, household equipment, food products, all manner of things that working families needed and wanted. And they were paying their workers wages that made it impossible for those workers to be genuine consumers of the products they were making. They were angry at me for raising my workers' wages because it created upward pressure on their own wage costs. Competing factories could not recruit workers as easily when Ford was paying $5 a day. The wage pressure was real, and I understood their frustration with the competitive implications. What they were not seeing, or were choosing not to see, was that every worker anywhere who received higher wages was a potential customer for everything those manufacturers made. The $5 day at Ford was not just an increase in Ford's labor costs. It was an increase in the purchasing power of tens of thousands of men who would, with that increased purchasing power, buy more furniture, more clothing, more tools, more food, more of everything those manufacturers made. Carnegie put this to me in a dinner conversation in those years, in terms that I found exact. He said that the factory owner who fights against workers' wages is fighting against his own customers. That the man across the table from him at the negotiating session, the worker asking for more money, is simultaneously the man who will buy his products if the money is given. That the equation is not wages versus profits. The equation is wages plus the purchasing power they create versus the narrow market that poverty-level wages leave available. He said this was the specific mistake that short-term profit thinking produces. The factory owner sees the wage cost on one ledger and the revenue on a separate ledger, and the connection between the two is invisible. The wage cost goes up, profit goes down. Fight the wage cost. But the revenue ledger, which reflects what the entire class of wage earners buys, goes up when wages go up, and the profit from that revenue increase is distributed across the whole economy, not just the individual factory. The man who raises wages pays the cost directly. He captures only a portion of the revenue benefit. The rest of the benefit goes to everyone whose goods the newly higher-waged workers now buy. This is the specific reason that the $5 day was not just good for Ford workers and good for Ford profits. It was good for the entire economy that those workers participated in as buyers. And the manufacturers who fought against it were fighting against their own future revenue without recognizing the connection. I want to describe something that happened in the decade following 1914 that I watched with a specific quality of attention, because it was the confirmation of the mechanism I had identified. As the $5 day policy spread, as other manufacturers raised wages under competitive pressure, and as the broader logic of paying workers enough to buy things gradually infiltrated industrial practice, the character of American life began to change in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Workers who had previously owned nothing beyond the bare necessities began owning things, not luxury things. The Model T first, for those who could save for it. Then refrigerators as those became available and affordable. Then radios. Then better housing. The accumulation of modest prosperity in working-class households was visible in the neighborhoods, in the shops that appeared to serve the new spending power, in the schools that improved as communities with more resources invested more in their children's education. The middle class did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive everywhere simultaneously. It arrived first where wages had risen most, in the industrial cities where the pressure from Ford's wage policy was felt earliest. And it spread outward, unevenly and imperfectly, as the logic of the thing worked its way through the economy. I am not claiming that I planned all of this. I did not. I solved a specific operational problem in my factory, and the solution happened to contain a mechanism that, when replicated at scale, changed the structure of American economic life. I saw that it contained that mechanism. I understood what it meant, but the scale of what it eventually produced was beyond what I had specifically intended in January of 1914. What I had intended was to run a more stable and more profitable factory. What I accidentally built, in the process of doing that, was the proof of a principle that changed what America believed was possible for ordinary people. I want to tell you something that has rarely been described accurately in the accounts of the $5 day decision, because the version that gets told publicly tends to make the decision sound cleaner and more confident than it actually was at the time. The opposition I expected from outside the company arrived as predicted. The newspapers, the competing manufacturers, the financial commentators. I had prepared myself for that. What I had not fully prepared for was the resistance that came from inside my own organization. Several of the men who ran departments within the company, men I had worked with and trusted, came to me in the weeks before and after the announcement with serious concerns. Not hostile concerns, genuine ones. They were worried about the financial sustainability of the wage level. They were worried about the precedent it set and whether it created expectations that could not be maintained if production slowed. They were worried about the administration of the qualification standards and whether the sociological department process was manageable at scale. These were not trivial concerns. They were real questions that deserved honest engagement. I listened to all of them. I did not dismiss any of them. But I also did not change the decision, because the analysis I had done on the underlying numbers supported the approach, and because I understood something about the nature of the resistance that helped me put it in context. Most of the men who came to me with concerns had their mental model of the business built around the prevailing wage structure. In their frame, wages were a cost column, and the goal was to minimize the cost column to maximize the profit column. Any increase in the wage was an increase in the cost and therefore a reduction in the profit. The frame was not wrong as a general principle. It was wrong as an analysis of this specific situation because it did not account for the cost of turnover that the prevailing wage was producing. When I put the turnover numbers alongside the wage numbers, the frame changed. The prevailing wage was not the low-cost option. It was the option that appeared low-cost on one ledger while generating enormous costs on a different ledger. The $5 day was more expensive on the wage ledger and cheaper on the total operational cost ledger. When both ledgers were visible simultaneously, the decision was much less controversial than it appeared when only the wage ledger was considered. This is a lesson I have applied many times since that period, and that I recommend to anyone managing any kind of operation. The cost that is visible on the obvious ledger is almost never the full cost. The obvious ledger shows what you pay directly. The hidden ledger shows what you pay through the consequences of what you paid directly. An arrangement that looks expensive on the obvious ledger but that reduces turnover, increases commitment, improves quality, and generates loyalty is often cheaper on the total cost than an arrangement that looks cheap on the obvious ledger but that produces expensive consequences you are paying for without fully seeing. Train yourself to look for the hidden ledger. Ask, for every major decision about what to pay, what am I currently paying in the consequences of not paying more? The answer to that question is often the most important number in the calculation, and it is the one that appears on no obvious report. Most of the newspaper coverage of the $5 day described it as philanthropy, as Henry Ford's gift to his workers, as a generous act by a wealthy man toward the men who worked for him. This framing was not accurate, and I want to be precise about why it was not accurate, because the inaccuracy is itself a lesson. Philanthropy is the transfer of resources from someone who has them to someone who needs them, motivated by compassion rather than by the expectation of a return. Philanthropy is genuinely valuable. It serves important purposes in the world, but it is not self-sustaining. It depends on the continued generosity of the person giving, and it ends when the giving stops. The $5 day was not philanthropy. It was a business decision made on the basis of a specific analysis that showed it would produce a financial return exceeding its cost. The workers who received it were not its objects. They were its mechanism. The mechanism worked because of how they responded to the arrangement, with lower turnover, with higher productivity, with the specific quality of engagement that comes from genuine financial security rather than from survival-level wages. The mechanism worked because of the purchasing power it created, which expanded the market for the product. A gift produces gratitude. A well-designed arrangement produces mutual benefit that sustains itself without depending on the ongoing generosity of either party. The $5 day was well designed, not perfectly. There were real problems with how the qualification system was administered, and I have acknowledged those. But structurally, the arrangement produced sustained mutual benefit rather than a one-directional gift. The difference between a gift and a well-designed arrangement matters practically. A gift to someone in a difficult situation may improve their immediate conditions without changing the structure that produced the difficulty. A well-designed arrangement changes the structure in a way that produces improvement that persists without continued gifts. The $5 day did not just help individual workers in their immediate situation. It changed the economic structure of what working men could participate in as buyers, which changed the trajectory of their lives and of their children's lives in ways that a gift could not have produced. When you are thinking about how to help the people around you, whether workers, partners, or people in your community, the question worth asking is not only how to give them something they need right now. It is also whether you can design an arrangement that changes their structural position in a way that persists and grows. The gift addresses the symptom. The well-designed arrangement addresses the structure. Both matter, but the second is rarer and produces more. I have been describing a historical event and its causes and consequences. I want to bring it to the practical level now, because the principle behind the $5 day is not specific to 1914 or to manufacturing or to Henry Ford. It is a principle about the relationship between what you pay, what you receive, and what gets built in the space between those two things. The principle is this: when you invest in the people and the relationships and the systems around you at a level significantly beyond what is required to maintain them at minimum function, you change the nature of what those people, relationships, and systems produce, not proportionally, disproportionately. Because the excess investment, the amount above what minimum function requires, is what builds genuine loyalty, genuine capability, genuine commitment, and genuine advocacy. And those things compound in ways that the cost of the excess investment never does. The worker who receives exactly the market wage has no specific reason to stay. The worker who receives significantly better than the market wage has a specific reason to stay, to perform well, to take care of the equipment and the relationships and the small decisions that add up to the quality of the operation. The difference in behavior between those two workers, multiplied across a workforce of 14,000, produces an operational difference that is larger than the wage differential that created it. This principle applies beyond factories. The partner in any arrangement who receives significantly better than the minimum required has a specific reason to bring their best. The supplier who receives significantly better terms than they could get elsewhere has a specific reason to prioritize your work. The person in any relationship who receives significantly more value than they contribute in the transaction has a specific reason to advocate for the relationship. The excess investment creates something that minimum investment cannot create. It creates loyalty, which is the willingness to stay and to bring the full capability of the person to the relationship, even when alternatives are available. Loyalty is not purchasable at the minimum price. It is produced by the excess. And the excess, when it produces loyalty at scale, pays for itself many times over through the operational advantages, the reduced friction, the quality of commitment, and the advocacy that loyalty generates. This is the $5 day principle applied to your life. What are the relationships, the partnerships, the arrangements in your current situation where you are paying the minimum to maintain function? And what would happen if you invested at a level that produced genuine loyalty in the person on the other side of the arrangement? Not theoretically, specifically, in your specific situation. Identify one and think about what the excess investment would cost and what the loyalty it might produce would be worth. Here is the second exercise. It applies the $5 day principle directly to your current situation. Write down the most important people in your professional world, the ones whose commitment and quality of effort most directly affects what you can build. List 5 of them. For each person, write honest answers to 2 questions. The first, am I paying them at a level that gives them a specific reason to stay and to bring their best, or am I paying the minimum that keeps them in the arrangement? The second, if they received a meaningfully better arrangement from someone else tomorrow, what would they do? If the honest answer to the second question is that they would take the better arrangement, then your current investment in that relationship is at the minimum function level. It is maintaining function. It is not building loyalty. And the difference between a person operating at minimum function and a person operating with genuine loyalty is significant in a way that is very difficult to see in any single day, but that is undeniable over months and years. Now write one specific action you could take in the next 30 days that would increase your investment in one of these relationships above the minimum, not across all 5. 1. Something concrete and specific that says to that person, I value what you bring here at a level significantly above what I am required to pay. Something that gives them a specific reason to bring more than the minimum the arrangement requires. Take that action. Observe what happens over the following 90 days to the quality of what that person brings to the arrangement. What you observe will either confirm or disprove the principle in your specific situation. In my experience, and in the experience of every man I have respected who ran significant operations, it confirms it, every time. Here is the thing that the $5 day taught me that went beyond the business case for it, and that I have thought about more than any other single idea in my working life. An economy is not a zero-sum game played between owners and workers. It is a system that produces what the people inside it are capable of producing, given the conditions they are operating in. When the conditions allow people to build something beyond survival, they build things. When the conditions limit people to survival, they survive. The difference in what gets built in those two scenarios is not proportional to the difference in the conditions. It is enormous, because building is exponential in a way that surviving is not. A man who is surviving is using all of his capability to maintain the current position. He has no surplus capability to apply to building something new. A man who is stable, who has the basics secured and some margin beyond them, has surplus capability available. He can think about tomorrow rather than just today. He can invest some attention in something that will be better a year from now rather than only in what will sustain him until next week. He can take small risks that a man with no margin cannot afford to take. The working men of America in 1914 who received the $5 day did not immediately become entrepreneurs. Most of them did not become wealthy, but many of them moved from survival mode to stability mode. And in stability mode, things happen that cannot happen in survival mode. Children receive more education. Small savings accumulate. Small investments become possible. Small additional activities, like Arthur's watch repair business, become available because there is margin to support them. The accumulation of these small movements out of survival mode and into stability mode, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of working families in the years following 1914, is what actually built the American middle class, not a single policy. The specific economic logic that connecting wages to purchasing power to market expansion created, which gradually spread because it was demonstrably profitable and demonstrably stabilizing for the economy that operated on it. This is the principle that is still available to anyone who understands it clearly enough to apply it, not in exactly the same form as the $5 day. The specific application changes with the specific context, but the underlying logic does not. Pay the people and invest in the systems and relationships around you at a level that produces stability and margin rather than only at the minimum level that maintains function. Because the difference between function and stability is the difference between what survives and what builds. And building is what produces everything you actually want, both for yourself and for the people whose lives are connected to what you are building. Let me close with the simplest version of everything I have said. In 1914, I paid workers enough to buy the product they made. This produced workforce stability, which reduced my costs. It produced purchasing power, which expanded my market. It produced loyalty, which improved the quality of the work. And it produced, in the aggregate, a living demonstration that an economy functions better when the people inside it have enough to participate in it as buyers rather than only as producers. These outcomes were not accidents. They were the logical consequences of a specific decision applied at sufficient scale. And the specific decision, the decision to invest in the people and systems around you at a level above the minimum required to maintain function, is as available today as it was in January of 1914. The two exercises I gave you are where this starts practically. The spending allocation exercise shows you where your current income is going and whether any of it is building something that will persist. The loyalty audit shows you where your current relationships are operating at minimum function and where a meaningful increase in investment would produce a disproportionate return in commitment and quality. Do both exercises this week, not next month, this week. Then make one change in one area based on what you find. One concrete change in how you are directing either your income or your investment in the relationships around you. The middle class was not built by accident or by the generosity of the powerful. It was built by a specific economic logic applied at specific scale. That logic is not large-scale or complicated. It is the simple truth that stability is more productive than survival, that investing above minimum function produces disproportionate returns, and that the people around you will build more when what they receive from you gives them a reason to. Apply that logic in your own situation, at whatever scale you currently operate. The size of the scale is not the point. The direction of the logic is. Listen to this message again tomorrow and the day after. The part of it that connects most directly to your current situation will be clearer each time. Come back to it whenever you are making a decision about what to invest in people or in relationships or in the systems around you. The logic holds.